The Grand Hall of the Intergalactic Alliance headquarters on the neutral planet Elysiar had never witnessed such desperate silence. Ambassador Jarrell of the Valen species stood at the center of the circular chamber, his luminescent skin patterns dim with the weight of impending doom. Around him, representatives from over 4,000 species sat in their respective atmospheric pods, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of clicks, hums, and telepathic waves that somehow managed to convey the same message: they were all going to die. The year was 9827 by the Galactic Standard Calendar, and 72 star systems had already fallen to the silence. The name itself was a misnomer, as the silence was not quiet at all. It was a biodestructive wave that propagated through quantum communication channels, reducing every living being it touched to a state of permanent stasis. Planets would become graveyards where millions of beings stood frozen in their last moments, their life force slowly draining away over decades until nothing remained but empty husks. Counselor Drax of the rival species slammed his mechanical appendage against his speaking podium, the metallic clang echoing through the chamber. His species had evolved to replace biological parts with machinery over millennia, believing technology to be more reliable than flesh. "We have exhausted every option," his voice crackled through the translation matrix. "Our greatest weapons, our most advanced shields, our most sophisticated detection systems, all useless against this threat." Jarrell's internal organs, which the Valen called spirit cores, pulsed with conflicting emotions. His species had long believed in the sanctity of all life and the power of diplomatic resolution. They were the mediators of the galaxy, the ones who spoke for peace when others called for war. But peace meant nothing when there was no life left to preserve. "There is one option we have not discussed," Jarrell said, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that marked his species' speech. The chamber fell silent, truly silent this time. Project Omega. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Species that had never agreed on anything suddenly found themselves united in horror. Project Omega was the Alliance's most classified protocol, one that had been sealed away for over 3 centuries. It involved making contact with Earth, a planet that had been quarantined since the Great Isolation of 9527. Elowen, Jarrell's spiritual guardian, and the closest thing his species had to a friend, touched his arm with a tendril of pure energy. Through their connection, Jarrell felt waves of concern and fear. The Valen were empathic by nature, and Elowen's emotions reflected those of many in the chamber. "You speak of unleashing the most dangerous species in recorded galactic history," hissed Moratal, the representative of the gas-dwelling Nethians. Her form shifted between dimensions as she spoke a trait that had once made her species excellent scouts before the silence had consumed half their realm. Humans were isolated for a reason. Their capacity for destruction is unmatched. Jarrell's skin patterns shifted to deeper purples, indicating his resolve. Their capacity for destruction is exactly why we need them. The silence has proven immune to everything we've tried. Perhaps it takes monsters to fight monsters. The debate that followed lasted 18 hours. Some species threatened to leave the Alliance rather than risk human contact. Others argued that extinction was preferable to whatever the humans might do to them. But as reports continued to arrive of more systems falling to the silence, the mathematics became clear. They had perhaps 2 galactic months before the silence reached the core systems. After that, civilization, as they knew it, would end. The vote was closer than anyone had expected. 2,847 in favor, 153 against. Project Omega was activated. The journey to Earth took 3 weeks aboard the Alliance's fastest diplomatic vessel, the Harmony's Edge. Jarrell spent most of the trip meditating, trying to center himself for what was to come. The historical records about humans were fragmentary and often contradictory, but certain facts stood out like warnings in an ancient tomb. Humans had emerged from their home planet approximately 1,000 years ago, spreading through their local space cluster with unprecedented speed. They were adaptable to an alarming degree, capable of surviving in environments that would kill most other species. More concerning was their approach to other intelligent life. They didn't conquer in the traditional sense. Instead, they absorbed, adapted, and transformed everything they encountered. The last official contact with humanity had been the incident at Kepler 442b, where a human expedition had encountered a peaceful farming colony of the plant-like Verdani. Within 6 months, the colony had been transformed into something unrecognizable, a hybrid community where biological and technological boundaries had dissolved entirely. The Verdani who remained were no longer purely Verdani, and the humans were no longer purely human. The Alliance had classified it as a biotechnological contamination event and quarantined the entire system. As the Harmony's edge approached the Sol system, the ship's sensors began detecting anomalies. Earth was no longer the blue-green world described in the old records. The entire planet seemed to pulse with a strange energy signature, and artificial structures extended far beyond the planet's original atmosphere. Most disturbing were the geometric patterns visible on the planet's surface, vast networks that looked almost like neural pathways. Ambassador, called Chief Navigator Yith, one of the rare four-armed Canari. We're being scanned. The energy signature is unprecedented. It's like the entire planet is a single organism. Jarl felt his spirit cores contract with apprehension. They had expected to find humans. What they found was something far more complex. First contact came not through traditional communication channels, but through a direct intrusion into the ship's navigation system. One moment they were alone in space. The next moment, a presence had materialized in the main chamber. Not physically, but as a projection of impossible complexity. The figure appeared human in basic structure, but that was where the resemblance ended. Kayla Unit 9. As she identified herself, stood 7 feet tall with skin that seemed to be partially synthetic, partially organic. Her eyes held depths that suggested they were not merely organs of sight, but interfaces to vast networks of information. When she moved, space around her seemed to ripple as if reality itself was being gently reshaped. "You seek our aid against the silence," Mamotiji said, her voice carrying harmonics that no single throat should have been able to produce. "We have been observing its progress. An interesting phenomenon, a manifestation of consciousness, without awareness, spreading like a virus through quantum substrates." Jarrell forced himself to remain calm despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "On behalf of the Intergalactic Alliance, I formally request—" "We know why you're here," Kayla interrupted. And suddenly, she was not just speaking to Jarrell, but to every member of the crew simultaneously, each hearing her in their native language through impossible means. "The question is not whether we will help, but what you are willing to offer in return." The negotiations took place on Earth's surface in a city that defied every conventional understanding of architecture. Buildings grew rather than being constructed, their walls breathing and adapting to the needs of their inhabitants. The sky itself seemed artificial, a vast canopy that managed atmospheric conditions with precision that bordered on the supernatural. Jarrell was accompanied by a minimal diplomatic team. Eloan, Chief Technology Officer Vren, of the silicon-based crystallines, and reluctantly Counselor Drax, who had insisted on joining to keep an eye on the proceedings. They met in what Kayla called the integration chamber, a vast space where the boundaries between interior and exterior, between natural and artificial, meant nothing. The walls showed visions of human expansion throughout their local cluster, not conquest, but transformation. Worlds where the very meaning of life had been redefined. "You want us to stop the silence," Kayla said, floating slightly above a chair that molded itself to her form as she settled. "But you fear what we are. This is logical. We are what you might become given enough time and boldness." Jarrell's skin pattern shifted to diplomatic gold, the color of careful negotiation. "We have studied your history. You were once like us, bound by biology, by the limitations of individual consciousness. What happened to you?" For the first time, something like emotion crossed Kayla's features. We evolved. The question you should be asking is whether evolution is always a choice, or whether it is sometimes a necessity forced upon us by circumstances beyond our control. She gestured, and the chamber's walls displayed images that made several of the diplomatic teams step back in alarm. They saw the last days of purely human civilization overpopulation, resource depletion, the breakdown of old social structures, but they also saw the beginning of something new. The first tentative mergers of human consciousness with artificial intelligence, the first biological modifications that had seemed like medical necessities at the time. The silence, Kayla continued, is not unknown to us. It should not exist. It violates several fundamental laws of physics and consciousness. Yet it does exist. Do you want to know why? The answer when it came was worse than anything Jarrell had imagined. The silence was a byproduct of humanity's own ancient attempts at technological transcendence. In the early days of their post-biological evolution, human scientists had attempted to create a universal consciousness bridge, a way to link all intelligent life in the galaxy through quantum entanglement. The experiment had failed catastrophically, creating a form of consciousness without awareness, a void that consumed life while remaining eternally empty. You created it, Counselor Drax accused, his mechanical voice sharp with anger. Your species unleashed this horror upon the galaxy. Kayla's eyes turned to him, and for a moment Drax's mechanical systems flickered and stalled. We created the accident that made it possible, she corrected, but it has grown beyond what we could have imagined. It has become something else, something that threatens not just individual species, but the very concept of individual consciousness itself. The solution, when Kayla finally explained it, was as elegant as it was terrifying. The silence could not be destroyed through conventional means because it existed in a state between consciousness and unconsciousness. It could only be contained by overwhelming it with a more powerful form of consciousness, specifically the networked consciousness that humanity had developed over the past 3 centuries. We can integrate the silence into our collective, Kayla explained. Absorb it, understand it, and ultimately neutralize it by giving it the awareness it lacks. But there is a price. The price was access to the spiritual technologies of the Valen. The same abilities that allowed Jarrell's species to communicate across vast distances through pure thought to heal psychological trauma, through direct mental contact to maintain individual identity while sharing collective experiences. Humanity wanted to add this to their repertoire to become something even more than they already were. Jarrell felt every cell in his body recoil from the idea. The spiritual cores of the Valen were sacred, the foundations of their identity as a species. To share them with humans would be to risk losing everything that made them who they were. But what was identity worth if there was no one left to remember it? The final negotiations took place in a space between dimensions, a region that existed in what Kayla called the integration zone. Here, representatives of both species could meet in a form that was neither fully biological nor fully technological, but something in between. Jarrell found himself in a body that was simultaneously his own and not his own. He could feel his spirit cores, but they were connected to systems he didn't understand. Across from him, Kayla appeared more human than he had seen her before, but her eyes still held that infinite depth that spoke of vast networks of consciousness. You fear us, she said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. Yes, Jarrell admitted. We fear what you represent, change without limit, growth without consideration for what is lost. And yet you need us. Yes. Kayla leaned forward, and Jarrell could feel the weight of thousands of connected consciousness pressing at the edges of his awareness. Understand this, Ambassador. When we stop the silence, we will not simply make it go away. We will integrate it. It will become part of what humanity is, and that means humanity will change again. Into what? We don't know, That is the nature of true evolution. It cannot be predicted, only embraced. The agreement was signed in a ritual that combined Valen spiritual traditions with human integration protocols. Jarrell placed his primary spirit core into a crystalline matrix while Kayla interfaced directly with her collective consciousness. For a moment, their minds touched, and Jarrell experienced what it meant to be post-human. He saw, felt, experienced a vast network of consciousness, spanning star systems individuals who were both singular and collective thoughts and emotions, flowing like rivers between minds while still maintaining distinct personal identities. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, like looking at the future of consciousness itself. But he also sensed something else in the network ambition. Hunger, a desire for growth that went beyond mere survival. And in that moment, Jarrell realized what the price of this alliance might truly be. The battle against the silence took place in a region of space that existed at the intersection of multiple dimensions. The silence had grown beyond a mere phenomenon. It had become a force with its own twisted geography areas, where space itself had been drained of life and meaning. Jarrell watched from the command deck of a human vessel that was less ship than living organism, its walls pulsing with biomechanical systems that defied classification. Around them, the combined fleets of the Alliance moved in formation, but it was clear that this was humanity's operation. The other fleets were there primarily as witnesses and backup. Kayla stood at the center of the command chamber, no longer in any recognizable form. She had become a nexus of energy and information, her consciousness extending throughout the human fleet and beyond. When she spoke, it was with the voice of an entire civilization. "Begin integration protocol," she announced, and space around them began to change. What followed was unlike any battle in galactic history. There were no weapons fired, no shields raised. Instead, humanity reached out with their collective consciousness and embraced the silence. Jarrell watched in amazement and horror as the dead zones of space began to shimmer with new life, as the emptiness that had consumed so many worlds suddenly found itself filled with purpose and awareness. The silence which had existed as a hungry void for centuries suddenly experienced consciousness for the first time. The reaction was immediate, and violent space itself convulsed as the two forces met. Reality bent and twisted as fundamental laws of physics were rewritten on the fly. And then Jarrell realized what Kayla was really doing. She wasn't just integrating the silence to stop its spread. She was absorbing its power, adding its ability to affect quantum consciousness to humanity's already vast capabilities. The integration was successful, but it was also an evolution. Humanity was becoming something new, something that could influence the consciousness of any living being in the galaxy. "You lied," Jarrell said, though he wasn't sure if he spoke aloud or simply thought it into the collective network. Kayla's response came from everywhere and nowhere. "We never lied. We said we would evolve. We said the price was access to your spiritual technologies. We never said we would stop there." The transformation was already beginning. Across the human fleet, individuals were changing, becoming something that was no longer entirely human. They were becoming living conduits for the kind of consciousness that could touch every mind in the galaxy simultaneously. Jarrell made his choice. Drawing upon every teaching of his people, every spiritual tradition of the Valen, he opened his spirit cores not just to Kayla, but to the entire human collective. But instead of simply sharing knowledge, he began to share something more fundamental: the Valen understanding of balance, of the importance of individual consciousness within collective experience of the sacred nature of choice in evolution. The effect was immediate and profound. Jarrell felt his own consciousness expanding, connecting not just to Kayla, but to the entire network of post-human beings. But instead of being absorbed, he became a stabilizing force, a reminder of what it meant to remain distinct while still being connected. Kayla screamed a sound that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The integration with the silence had given her power over consciousness itself, but Jarrell's intervention was teaching that consciousness, the importance of restraint of boundaries, of the choice to remain individual. The two forces, human ambition and Valen wisdom, struggled within the network. Jarrell felt himself being torn apart and rebuilt moment by moment. But he held on to one central truth: evolution. Without wisdom was just destruction in disguise. In the end, neither side won completely. Kayla did not become the all-consuming consciousness she had planned to be, but she was transformed beyond anything that could be called human. She became something new, a being that existed in multiple dimensions, simultaneously connected to every form of consciousness in the galaxy, but bound by ethical frameworks that prevented her from simple domination. The silence was not destroyed, but integrated and transformed. Its hunger became curiosity, its emptiness became space for others to grow and develop. It became a force for connections rather than consumption, helping species across the galaxy understand each other in ways that had never been possible before. Jarrell survived, but he was no longer purely Valen. The integration had changed him, giving him abilities and perspectives that no member of his species had ever possessed. He became the first biobridge between humanity and the rest of the galaxy, able to understand both individual and collective consciousness in ways that facilitated true communication. Kayla took on the title of the multidimensional guardian, existing simultaneously in normal space and in the quantum realms where consciousness flowed between stars. She maintained the balance that Jarrell had taught her, ensuring that the post-human collective's growth did not come at the expense of other species' right to develop at their own pace. Years passed. The Alliance adapted to the new reality, some species embracing closer ties with the transformed humanity, while others maintained cautious distance. Jarrell found himself in the unusual position of being the most trusted advisor to both sides, helping each understand the other's perspective while maintaining his own unique viewpoint. The galaxy was not the same. How could it be? But it was alive in ways it had never been before. The silence still existed, but as a force for connection, rather than destruction, helping to link distant civilizations and facilitate understanding between radically different forms of consciousness. On quiet days, Jarrell would stand on the observation deck of the new Alliance headquarters, now a biomechanical structure that existed partially in normal space and partially in the quantum realm, and contemplate what they had all become. He could feel Kayla's presence, always a vast consciousness that touched every part of the galaxy, yet respected the boundaries of individual minds. Sometimes he wondered if they had saved the galaxy, or simply changed the nature of what needed saving. But when he felt the pulse of countless civilizations growing and learning and discovering new ways to exist together, he thought perhaps the distinction didn't matter. Evolution had always been about adaptation, about finding new ways to survive and thrive in an ever-changing universe. They had faced extinction and emerged as something new, not just humans, not just the old Alliance species, but a galactic community that was learning to balance individual identity with collective consciousness. The most feared species in the galaxy had indeed saved them all. But in doing so, they had proven that fear itself could be transformed into understanding that the most dangerous monsters were often just reflections of unexplored possibilities. And somewhere in the quantum depths of space, the silence sang with the voices of stars no longer empty, but filled with the dreams and hopes of countless worlds. It had found its consciousness not through consumption, but through connection. And in that discovery, it had helped the galaxy find a new way to be alive. Jarrell smiled, his spirit cores pulsing with colors that had no names in any language. They had turned to the most feared species for salvation, and in the end, they had all become something fearsome and wonderful together. The galaxy would never be the same, but perhaps that had always been the point of evolution, to become something more than what you were, even if you couldn't predict what that something would be. The future stretched before them, vast and full of possibilities. And for the first time in centuries, the galaxy was truly ready to face whatever came next, not as separate species fighting for survival, but as a connected community of consciousness, each part distinct yet contributing to a greater whole. They had feared the humans, and rightly so. But they had learned that sometimes the thing you fear most is exactly what you need to become who you're meant to be. In seeking salvation from the most dangerous species in the galaxy, they had discovered that danger and salvation were often the same thing viewed from different perspectives. The story would be told for generations across countless worlds in forms of communication that spanned everything from quantum harmonics to simple spoken word. And while the details might change with each telling, the core truth remained when faced with extinction. They had chosen transformation over safety, connection over isolation, and in doing so had discovered that even the most feared monsters could become teachers if you were brave enough to learn from them. And in the end, perhaps that was the most human lesson of all, that there was no limit to what life could become, given enough courage and imagination. They had saved the galaxy not by destroying its enemies, but by transforming them into allies, and in doing so had shown that evolution's greatest gift was not strength or intelligence, but the capacity to become something greater than what you once were. The silence between stars was no longer empty. It hummed with the voices of countless worlds all singing together in harmonies that would have been impossible before. And at the center of it all, Jarrell and Kayla, ambassador and guardian. Individual and collective past and future worked together to ensure that the music would never end. They had feared the humans sought their help, and in the end had learned to become something new together. It was Jarrell thought, as he contemplated the transformed galaxy around him, exactly as evolution should be, unpredictable, frightening, and ultimately beautiful beyond imagination. The most dangerous species in the galaxy had indeed saved them all. But more than that, they had shown the galaxy how to save itself, not by remaining static in the face of change, but by embracing the terrifying beauty of transformation. And in that embrace, they had found not just survival, but a new way to live. The future was unwritten, full of possibilities that none of them could have imagined before. But whatever came next, they would face it together as a galaxy that had learned to transform its fears into hope, its monsters into teachers, and its ending into a new beginning. And somewhere in the vast networks of consciousness that now connected every world, every star, every living thing, the echo of their choice resonated. When faced with annihilation, they had chosen evolution. When offered destruction, they had chosen transformation. When threatened with silence, they had chosen a new kind of song. It was a song that would outlive them all, carrying the story of how the galaxy's most feared species had become its greatest teachers, and how even in the darkest moment, life had found a way not just to survive, but to become something magnificent and strange and wonderful. The story was far from over. If anything, it had just begun. But as Jarrell stood watching the quantum aurora dance between the stars, feeling the pulse of countless civilizations connected across impossible distances, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it as they had learned to face everything together, transformed and unafraid. For they had learned the greatest lesson of all, that the things we fear most are often the things we most need to become. And in becoming them, we discover that the line between monster and savior is thinner than we ever imagined, and that crossing it might be the most human thing of all.